which I thought was a nice metaphor I heard from a guy once. So depending on exactly where you set the shutter, you'll get different effects. And I'll show you some examples of all of those. And slow shutters can also enhance reflections. And I'll just say they will enhance reflections unless you take action to stop that. Longer exposure times cause you to collect light over time. It's almost the same thing you're doing with astrophotography. You're collecting light, you're gathering it. And so a slow shutter can cause reflections to grow or become more pronounced. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing. And I'll show you examples of both. You can use a slow shutter to create a very peaceful aura, especially with very long exposures. Seascapes, creeks, rivers, anything with moving water can look extremely peaceful when shot with a very slow shutter. The trade-off here is drama. If you do that, if you go to that extreme, you really suck the drama right out of the image, and the whole thing is about that sense of serenity. You can add or enhance starbursts. A lot of folks don't know this. I learned it by accident. I think shooting from the Jackson Street Bridge one night. We all know, I think, that if you shoot with a small aperture and you have a really bright thing in the image, in the frame, maybe it's the sun, you'll get starbursts. Well, if you shoot even with a wide open aperture, but you have it open long enough, the same thing happens. You get starbursts just by shooting with a slow shutter, even with a bigger aperture. And of course, you can expose details from darkness. Photography, slow shutter is a great way to do astrophotography. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll stop and mention to you, in case the club has interest, Travis Rhodes did a presentation for North Georgia that was specific to astrophotography. And he did a really nice job with it. He does, of course, a great professional job on anything he does. But that'll get into a lot more detail on it. If it's something your club might be interested in, that CPS might be interested in, you might think about seeing if he would do it for you guys too. I'm just going to touch on it. I think I have one slide in here that touches on some of the key elements of astrophotography. Some hitches with slow shutter. One is image stabilization. It can help, but slow shutters are pretty tough to do handheld, and especially combined with a long focal length or low light levels. If the moving subject is what you're trying to get sharp, and you want the background to be allowed to blur to show motion, tripods are almost useless in this situation. I've seen some people who might use a monopod if they have a really big lens that's really heavy and hard for them to hold in order to be able to pan. But typically panning is a handheld thing. It's very fun, it's very challenging. But if you try that with a slow shutter to get that blur effect, your success rate is going to be very low. And you just have to go into it knowing that you're going to shoot 300 frames and maybe get 5 that you really like. And that's okay, that would be a decent success rate. Now, if the background is to be sharp and the subject blurred, now you're going to be using a tripod, a remote button, something like that. Slow shutters in really good light are going to require you to reduce your exposure someplace else. Sounds like common sense, but you got to think a little bit about how far can you go. If you have bright light, you can cut the ISO to the lowest number on your camera, 50, 100, 200, depending on what you're shooting with. You can shrink the aperture to a certain point. You still have to be mindful of diffraction. You may not want to go much past f16 or f22. And then when all of the above are not enough to darken the image, then you're going to need to have a neutral density filter. So these are definitely things to own if you intend to do some slow shutter photography. Neutral density filters come in a variety of flavors. Also, polarizers can help darken the image a little bit while also reducing glare and enhancing colors. And I'll talk a little bit more about those. I suggest, if you don't own them already, to consider investing in some 4-inch square neutral density filters. Lee makes them, they're very expensive. Other companies make them that aren't quite as expensive. I would say don't get cheap on this stuff, and then get adapter rings just for the lenses that you're really going to do this kind of photography with. You don't have to have them for every lens. I've got 2 sizes that covers 3 of my lenses. And the main thing I shoot with this kind of stuff is a 10 to 20 zoom, 10 to 20 millimeter zoom. And then I have an 18 to 35 that I use also. But I have a 6 stop and a 10 stop uh, neutral density filter. And between those two, which I can also combine if necessary, I can pretty much slow that shutter down as much as I ever need to. So slow shutter uses, one of the iconic historical shots is Waterfalls. We've all done it. It's probably one of the first cool tricks you tried when you learned photography and you learned how to shoot in manual mode. Um, you're going to want a tripod and a remote shutter button. A lot of people still use a mechanical button, and that's fine. I find that a wireless infrared button, if your camera can work from it, is even more convenient. Um, I'm going to make a suggestion on technique here. I use live view when I'm doing this kind of photography. I'll set up on the tripod and I'll leave the camera semi-snugged. And then I'll go to live view, frame the image the way I want to frame it so I can see what it looks like and decide what part of that image do I want to be the sharpest. Then I point the camera straight at that spot, snug it down just a little bit on the tripod, and I hit 100% zoom on on my live view mode. And then I flip to manual focus and I focus that thing, tack sharp on that spot. It might be a rock right at the base of a waterfall, for instance. I'll do that. Then I back away from the 100%. Then I frame the shot exactly the way I want it, and now I'm ready to shoot. That's actually a tip for anything where you're using the tripod. It's a handy trick to use. You generally want the rocks and trees and stuff around it to be sharp and the water to be the only thing that blurs. So just be mindful if it's a windy day, keep your eye out on what's happening with the foliage around you, grasses, branches, and that kind of stuff. You might wait a minute for the gust to stop in order to not get the blur, or you might decide that you want that in the image. It's up to you, but it's just something to be mindful of. And I always tell people this too, consider the lighting that you have at that moment in time. Sometimes waiting a few minutes can help you out. There might be an intrusive shaft of sunlight breaking through between a couple branches that's hitting a wet rock. You see the glare as you're looking at it, your camera's going to see it even worse. You're going to have a blown out spot there. So sometimes waiting a couple minutes, I'll look up and see, are there any clouds that might maybe help me out here? And I'll hold out for that. Or I may walk further up the trail and shoot something else and then come back later. But you don't want really hot spots in these photographs. They're very hard to fix in post. I would say take multiple shots with varying speeds. You really don't know what you're going to like best until you see it on a computer. We all cheat a little bit and look at the back of the camera and kind of review images. Did I get it? Did I get what I wanted? You can kind of tell, but there will be subtle differences when you see it on a bigger screen that you could not see on that 3-inch back of the camera monitor. Very slow shutters, of course, are going to require some help to slow the exposure down. So that's where you'll use your ND filters. I usually do all my pre-focusing and setup first, and then I slap the NDs on because it's really hard to see through those very dark things and acquire focus. So I do the focus first.
Rick, can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
When you talk about the glare on the rocks, wouldn't this be with the polarizer be a good time to use one of those?
Yes, sir. Polarizers will help a lot with general darkening and also with removing glare. I think I've got some comments on polarizers in here a little further ahead that are more detailed, but they also enhance colors. I use a polarizer almost always when I'm doing any kind of landscape photography for that reason. But,
Thank you.
Yeah, but if you've got a shaft of light on something, I mean, the polarizer is not going to cure that. Okay, I mean, if you've got a shaft of pure sunlight coming in and hitting a spot, you're not probably going to be able to fix that. If you're shooting in the daytime with a DSLR, now this does not apply to people shooting with mirrorless. But with the DSLR, the viewfinder is essentially another window into the inside of the camera that light can come through. So what can happen is if you're shooting with the sun behind you, and I've had this happen a couple of times before I was smart enough to figure it out, you get these weird pink distortions in your image and you can't fix that. So I always have a roll of electrical tape with me in my bag. When I'm in a situation where there's something really bright behind me, I'll take a piece of that and I'll put it over the viewfinder. I don't actually touch the viewfinder, I touch the edge around it and just cover that spot so the light can't break in the back door. The other situation where I've run into that, oddly enough, is at night doing astrophotography. I was at a place where cars could pull up behind me and park, and a headlight would come right into the back of the camera. And I never thought about putting the tape over the back of the camera at night, but I learned that night that you should do it sometimes. And again, on ND filters, I did make the mistake of buying some cheap plastic ones one time. I recommend don't even try it. Get something glass. They don't have to be leaves. There are other brands that are good, that are a bit less expensive, but get some good ones. All right, so some examples of waterfalls. This is a fall shot at Fort Mountain. This is one place I love to go. I've been there a few times to do this kind of photography. And in this case, I shot pretty darn slow at 1.6 seconds. And what that did was it gave a real soft look to that water coming across those rocks. I did that because it felt appropriate for this morning fog that I had going on up here. And it just kind of feels like it should be a peaceful, soft presentation. Now, I'll tell you, I shot it with a bunch of different shutter speeds just to see what I would get. This was the one I liked best, but that's why I liked it best. It just seems to fit with the mood, if you will, of having some fog in there. Here's the same spot the following summer. I went back there and hiked in with Mary, my wife, and we shot it with a faster shutter here. This is 1/4 of a second, and you see a big difference here. You can see quite a bit of streaking in the water. There's more drama to it. You've got these streaks over here on this side. Those are basically drops of water that are being stretched out through 1/4 second of time. And then the streaks down here. So it shows a lot more, I guess it's more active looking. We also have glare in this, which tells you I did not use a polarizer. And in hindsight, that was before I owned the one I have now. I would have preferred to shoot this with the polarizer. It would have made these rocks a little less prominent. But again, from the standpoint of the shutter speed, you can see that's 1.6 seconds, and that's 1/4 of a second. So 1/4 of a second is still slow when you're shooting moving water, but very, very different outcome. Again, I would set this up, frame it the way I wanted it, and then shoot it probably 20 different ways, different shutter speeds, and so on. And once I find a shutter speed I like, I might shoot it again several times, because there will be little differences that I can't see until later when I'm looking at them in post. This is a much longer exposure, Dukes Creek, with a 6-second exposure, and you get shaving cream with 6 seconds in moving water like this in a waterfall. I did shoot this with a pretty tight aperture at f/14, but it wasn't to slow the shutter down. That was to get this foreground log as sharp as I could, in addition to the background being in focus. So that was for depth of field purposes. But I did use a polarizer on this shot to get 6 seconds. This is a waterfall that's normally not very interesting, though I've been lucky there a couple times. This one, Vickery Creek in Roswell, at 0.8 of a second, you do see some drama still in this image. You've got a lot of rippling going on out here with the water coming over the rocks, and you have the streaks in here where the bubbles are kind of getting pushed off into this little alcove over here. It becomes a bit of a whirlpool. So that's 0.8 of a second. And again, I shot this at some much slower shutter speeds, and I found those pictures to be boring. I see this one's got a little bit of energy to it. And this one is way toward the slow end again. This is at Cloudland Canyon. This is a 13-second exposure. So the water is nothing but mush, but the reason for going so slow on this one is we had these fall leaves landing in the pool, And a lot of times you'll find waterfalls where this happens. There's a pool at the base of the waterfall, and then leaves will tend to form a circle. There's a little bit of a whirlpool in there, very slow. So with 13 seconds, I have another one I shot at 30 of the same place that was panoramic. It looks almost the same though, but you get this nice circular pattern as the leaves are going around that whirlpool. All right, some other uses, rivers and streams. Again, a tripod and a remote button. I suggest live view for focus and managing the shot, and then black tape, have it handy just in case. Look for interesting splash patterns around rocks and logs. Anything that water is running through, try to find some interesting features in there as you're framing up a shot. Compose, experiment, shoot with a lot of different shutter speeds. Try both orientations, and I would say this about almost all photography. You know, we have a tendency to see it one way or the other. Oh, that looks like a landscape shot, or that looks like a portrait shot. There's a lot of times where shooting it both ways can really help you out because the better shot is the one you weren't anticipating. Showed you that waterfall shot from Cloudland Canyon a minute ago. That was shot portrait style. I also shot it landscape, but the portrait photo came out better. Looks better that way. And the reason was, let's sit back to that shot. That sky, I got some nice blur in the clouds, and I got a little bit of blue sky up there. The shot that I took portrait, in order to fit everything in properly, I didn't get much sky at all. So again, at the time, it looked like I wanted it to be a portrait shot or a landscape shot, but I went ahead and shot it portrait also, just for the heck of it, and I wound up liking that shot better. So just something to think about with almost anything you're shooting, to consider both orientations. Okay.
Jerry, Rick,
yes, sir.
Quick question, sir. That 10 millimeter, is that on a full frame or APS-C, or what kind of sensor are we talking about?
Good question. That's on an APS-C 1.5 crop factor. So it's equivalent of 15 millimeters.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Very slow shutter speeds can remove ripples and waves and swirls, anything like that from the water. Reflections are going to exaggerate with the slower the shutter you use. And sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes not. And I'll show you examples of that. Look for the amount of blur that you like best for that composition. In other words, shoot a few different shutter speeds and see kind of what shutter speed you like best. And then once you find a speed that looks good, at least in the camera, reshoot that thing many, many times at the same shutter speed. Little variations in the waves and the splashes and all that stuff can make a big difference to how that thing looks to you when you get it on the screen at home. And, you know, we're not paying for film anymore. It's all pretty much free. Just go ahead and fill that SD card up. It's a pain in the butt later to sift through them all. But sometimes you'll just be, there's another one, another one, another one. Oh, there it is. That's what I was looking for. And it's just Mother Nature. You know, you're catching all these different moments of Mother Nature at work. And one's going to look better than the others do. Again, look out for hot spots, lighting wise. I don't know how many times I've come back thinking I got something that I wanted and then be disappointed because there was a really bad hot spot or a couple of them in the image that I didn't notice when I was shooting. So rivers and streams. These three are to illustrate what I was talking about with reflections. So if you look at the top left, these are all the same stream, obviously. This is shot pretty quick, a quarter of a second. You've got a little bit of blur in the water here, not much. But notice you can see the bottom of this creek very clearly. You can see the dark rocks and the gray sand. You start to lose some of that at 1 second in this middle image, and you really lose it over here with a 10-second exposure. And as you look down the stream, this whole run here, it almost looks like ice versus this shot where you can tell it's just moving water. That's that cumulative effect of the reflection from a longer exposure. So this is a case where maybe I don't want that effect. That maybe I'd rather have the blur of the water, but I also want to be able to see the features on the bottom. So this is where a polarizer, high-low, so that would definitely help you out. Using a circular polarizer on this might eliminate or at least greatly reduce that glare. Here's an example of a shot with, this was shot at 1.6 seconds. I shot this so many times at different exposures, but at the end of the day, I had several where the clouds sort of framed in this tree the way they do here with a nice blue border, but only one of them where this wave right here broke toward me the way it's doing. And I liked that one the best. It looked quite a bit better than the other images. That's the benefit of shooting a bunch of shots is you might find that one is just a little bit better than the others, even though it's all the same exposure. This one is, I mean, this becomes an abstract, a shot like this. A lot of contrast. The colors weren't interesting anyway, but the contrast was, so I made it black and white. But this is a 6-second shot, and even though it's a very slow exposure, you have a fair bit of drama in this image. Talking about reflections just a little bit more. This is Chattanooga, of course, the aquarium, the freshwater aquarium across the river here. And you see these reflections are starting to creep toward me with a 15-second exposure. Sorry, I clicked ahead. And the color is starting to accumulate. Now, in fairness, this shot is a bit earlier, so that's one of the other reasons these colors saturated better. But this is a 25-second shot, and these colors are now coming almost all the way across toward me, across the river. The river's flattening way out thanks to that accumulation of time. And the other thing we're doing is we're getting nice starbursts on the lights, partly because it's f10, but partly because it's a slow shutter. So some other uses of slow shutters. Sports is an interesting one to play with. You can freeze the background and allow the subject to blur a little bit within a frame. You're going to use a tripod and a remote button. You can shoot pretty much anything that moves, makes itself a good target for this type of photography. I would say try different shutter speeds, but depending on the desired effect, you're probably going to be toward the faster end of slow in order to keep the subject recognizable. And I'll show you examples of, shutter speeds that aren't really all that slow. There can be a lot of movement in the image if you have something that's moving fast, like a soccer player. Super slow shutters, a moving subject can actually disappear entirely. Actually, sometimes that's handy. If you're doing like a landscape and you're doing a 30-second shot and somebody walks across the image in front of you, you're probably fine. They probably won't even show up in the image because the shutter speed is so slow you didn't capture them enough. You can freeze or nearly freeze the subject and allow the background to blur. This is panning, slow shutter panning. It's a handheld technique and it's a little tricky. You want to shoot the subject in motion by tracking it, moving through space, and then clicking the button when you want to get them. There's a lot of variables to this, the exact shutter speed that you've chosen, the focal length or effective focal length that you're using. The longer the lens, the harder it's going to be to get the subject sharp. Your distance to the subject, your distance to the background, and so on. One of the big factors, honestly, is your camera's autofocus performance. If it has very quick autofocus capture, you'll have a better success rate than I do with my Pentax, which has terrible autofocus performance. Although they're supposed to be coming out with a new camera that'll fix that for me. But it just adds to the challenge. And again, you're going to have a low hit rate on these anyway. You're going to have a lot of garbage to get a few good shots. But some fun subjects for slow shutter panning, race cars in particular, but cars, boats, football players, kayaks, rafts, surfers. I've done all of them with varying degrees of success. Virtually anything where a subject is in motion. Again, a low percentage technique. You're going to be tossing a lot, but we have pretty big SD cards these days, so go ahead and fill it up. A little bit on that topic. So I mentioned at the beginning that this isn't really a long exposure discussion, it's a slow shutter discussion. And when you got a car like that coming at you, 1/250 is actually a pretty slow shutter speed when you're shooting, especially with 450 millimeters of effective lens. So I've got some blur in the background. I've got some blur on the street. You can see the tire, letters on the tires have blurred, but the subject is exactly what I want, tack sharp. You can read moto across his helmet. That's kind of what I'm trying to accomplish when I do slow shutter panning with racing stuff. Here's an example of a boat. This is at Lake Guntersville a couple summers ago when they were still doing this stuff. And 1/100th of a second with that same big boy lens I have. I took a few of these I took quite a few of these in order to get a couple that were pretty darn sharp. Another one of the cars up at Road Atlanta. And you can see the movement in this image. You can even see the tires. He's clearly into a right turn because that outside tire is starting to pick up on the outer edge, as is the front. But that's what you're looking for. In this case, I like the lines that the tires had made coming around that turn, and he's sort of coming into that now. Another car from up there. Probably one of my best. You know, sometimes your best photos are half accident. This was one of those. So I got to tell a quick story. I shoot Pentax, which no one in the world does. There might be two other people. And I have this big bad 300 millimeter lens, very heavy. And that's what I'm shooting these. These are radio controlled boats. They're about 3 feet long and they go 70 miles an hour. So it's a nice challenging subject for slow shutter panning. So I was shooting these things and I wasn't really confident yet to try to shoot them with a slow shutter. I was doing shutter speeds of 1/1000 or whatever. But I had my camera in aperture priority, and the aperture dial is on the front of the camera. So because the thing was so heavy, the camera would be down at my side. I'd wait for a boat to come by and I'd pull it up, take my shot, and then drop it back down again. And one time I pulled it up, and as I was pulling it up, my finger scrolled that aperture all the way to f/25. So I ended up with this 1/30 shutter speed with 450 millimeters of lens, and I happened to catch the boat the way I wanted to. So I got all that extra blur. To try to shoot these things at 1/30, I'd probably get one out of 500 of them to show up, but I got lucky on that one. Okay, sometimes a bit of blur in the subject also is kind of cool. And I've got one example. I've seen better ones, but I'll show you what I've got. So this is another one of those boats, a little race boat. The boat itself isn't very sharp, but I really liked the image as a semi-abstract. It almost looks like an arrow or feather or something, the way it's going across the water there. And I've got some reflection from it too, but that's a 30th of a second with that big lens. And then sometimes a fast shutter conveys speed better than a slow shutter. Some more examples from Guntersville. These are very fast shutter shots, 1/2000. A couple of race boats coming around the corner. These are the gas class boats, I guess. This is one of the turbine boats coming around the bend and looking like he's going to tip over. Also very fast shutter speed, 1/1250. So if the intention is to convey speed, just making this point, sometimes you can convey speed just fine by freezing that image, by freezing that moment in time. And especially with something like these boats where they're throwing up these ridiculous rooster tails. Vehicular light trails is another use of slow shutters. We've probably all either seen or done this one. Think of the iconic Atlanta Jackson Street Bridge. I know Mark Chandler has done an absolutely fabulous Jackson Street shot, which I think he's sold a number of times already. If you haven't done it yet, please do it. My suggestion, though, would be to bring a friend or two with you, especially if you're going to do it at night, which is the best time to do it. Sunrise to twilight, it's always an interesting spot. And there are other spots downtown to shoot vehicular traffic with a slow shutter, but that's one of the best. If you can get a night where you get interesting clouds, that really helps a lot too. You got to compose with some foreground objects in mind. There are some light poles that can really be a pain to clean up in Photoshop or Lightroom later, but if you can frame the thing out of the way a little bit, that might help. You can also shoot it, of course, in the daylight with neutral density filters. I'm not sure it's as exciting as the night shots. Nice to shoot there at golden hour. Sometimes you get some beautiful lighting on the buildings. And a little bit after that, of course, you've got blue hour, and I'm going to show you one of those in a moment. I try to get headlights and taillights showing in all the lanes when you're doing one of these things. Now, a lot of people have mad skills with Photoshop, Sally Hale, and can easily do the stuff that I have to look up in YouTube to figure out how. But for instance, you can combine multiple exposures in Photoshop, and then have light trails in every lane the way you want to see them. Or if you can shoot slow enough shutter, you may get lucky with that. When you think you have it perfect, shoot several more just to be sure you come back with a keeper. And then try different positions on the bridge or wherever you are, different crops, different angles to see if you can come up with something unique. Almost all of us have shot the same sort of straight on shots, but there might be some other things there to try. This first example is a cell phone shot. This was my kind of getting used to the area shot. I took this picture. I love these clouds up here that particular afternoon. And I can tell you, Greg Evans got a gorgeous shot of this with his real camera. I don't think I was even set up yet. But here's what I was talking about with stuff that you have to think about where this stupid lamppost is and what you maybe can do later to fix it, or if you can move around it or whatever. But this is just a normal shot to give you a framework. And then this is on the camera with a 25-second exposure. And I still don't have light trails here in this little stretch here, but I've got the rest of the lanes covered. I had some nice blue hour light in the background. Those clouds that I showed you from the first image were still there pretty much, and the blue hour light was crashing through them. So we got some nice contrast from that. Okay, just show you a few other examples of things. This is Krog Street tunnel, and notice this is a half-second image, but you can't even tell what that white vehicle is. I don't know if it's a car or a truck, a van, what it is. So even a half a second is a little bit too slow to get any kind of detail on what that moving object is. Now in this case, I went very slow. I went 8 seconds, and my intention here was I really liked the composition. I liked the framings and the colors on the far wall. And just having a few cars drive by during that 8 seconds gave me some nice headlight and taillight streaks straight across the bottom here, kind of helping to cause a frame. What I didn't know about it was sort of a bonus later. I knew this guy was over there playing around, but I didn't know he was in this image. This is actually one of the artists. In one of my other photos taken from that day, you could see a paint can in his hand. So this is one of the guys making that art that I was there photographing, and I got him looking kind of ghostly because he moved a little bit within that 8 seconds, I guess. Seascapes are a big one. I've seen a number of photographers have done some great slow shutter work with seascapes. That is still aspirational for me. Full disclosure, I'm going to show you a couple pictures and they're terrible. The only reason they're included in here is to show you the effect of the different shutter speeds, but I don't have the shot I'm about to describe yet. Tripod and button, moving clouds can really help out and make the image very interesting, giving you some beautiful streakiness up in the sky. Slightly slower shutters for seascapes are going to give you some drama with the crashing waves, and the effect will be muted a little bit or softened a little bit. The other thing I'd say about this particular topic is sometimes slow isn't slow enough. You may need to do multiple exposures of slow shutter and combine them, especially if you're trying to get a lot of cloud movement, because unless you have a decent wind pushing those clouds, it can take a very long time to capture the motion of those clouds. So you may need, 5 or 6 or 7 30-second shots to convey that. A really slow shutter speed or again, multiple exposures can absolutely obliterate movement of a sea, of an ocean, just flatten it right out. The result can be a very peaceful impression, but you really need to have something of interest in the frame for that to work. And just remember that boats and buoys and waterfowl and surfers, anything out there on the water is going to completely blur out. So again, I don't have good images to show you. I'm going to show you shutter speeds. This is a half a second at Outer Banks. And what you see is you get this beginnings of blur to the waves crashing. You have this wave that already crashed that's pushing the foam in ashore. Down here, you've got a 6-second exposure, and it's starting to turn to nothing. It's starting to just flatten right out. And you've got a little bit of action still out here on these waves where you can tell a little bit of shape, I guess, that they're waves. If that were slowed down to about a minute or 2 minutes, that ocean would look absolutely flat. A little bit on astrophotography, and again, I recommend for the club, if you have interest, talking to Travis about doing his presentation. Slow shutter speeds collect and accumulate light, so really dim objects can become visible that aren't normally visible to the eye. Consider timing with lunar phase. The darker the sky, the better, and of course, consider location too. Some locations are going to be much more amenable to getting a dark sky. It's pretty hard to do really almost anywhere in the continental US, but there are some places where you can get it a bit darker. You just don't want to go out when you've got a full moon. Tripod and remote shutter button, of course. For DSLRs, consider covering the eyepiece, especially if there's the potential for something bright to come up behind you. You're going to tend to use larger apertures, and it's okay to crank your ISO up if you need to. Again, you can do a lot of cleanup and post these days with ISO noise, but you're going to need the help from an exposure standpoint. My suggestion here is very similar to what I told you early on with Waterfalls about pre-focusing. I suggest using live view and doing a 100% zoom on something bright. I would pick the brightest star you can find, set your tripod up, point at it, and use manual focus to make that thing turn into a point, because a star should look like a point. If it looks round, you're not really in focus. Get that thing as sharp as you can, then back away, leave it in manual focus, and try not to bump the lens. I suggest bringing a red flashlight. This is really a practical tool. One, it keeps you from falling on your hind end when you're walking around in the dark, but it's also a good way to be able to see things when you need to make a change to a setting or what have you, without trashing your pupils and making it so you can't see anything for the next 20 minutes. Now, if you're not trying to get star trails are a subject unto themselves that you might want to go for, but if that's not what you're trying to do, if you're trying to get a nice exposure to the Milky Way, for example, there's a time limit. You can't go beyond a certain amount of time depending on the lens that you have on and the focal length that you're working with. Specifically, the effective focal length that you're working with. So there's this rule of 500. Some of you have heard of it. I know Umit knows about it because he does a fair bit of astro. But on a full frame camera, the rule of 500 applies directly. You take 500, you divide it by the focal length of the lens, and that's how many seconds you can go roughly at that crop before you start to get star trails showing up. In other words, the stars begin to smear because of the Earth's rotation. So if you want to avoid that and have your stars look like stars, that's the rule, the 500 rule. You take 500 and divide it by your effective focal length. So I've got a couple examples here. I happen to shoot Pentax, which is a crop camera with a 1.5x crop, which is the same crop size that Nikon uses and Sony uses. So in my case, a 15 millimeter lens, I've got to multiply that by 1.5 first and then divide it into 500. I can go 22 seconds before I start to get star trails. With a Canon, the crop is a little bit tighter. I've only got 21 seconds. Olympus and Panasonic use the Micro Four Thirds, which is a 2x crop. So that's the math on it. You can easily figure that out for your lens and then know what your maximum shutter speed is before you get that star trail thing. One more word on that. Remember that that only works to the crop that you're actually shooting at. If you later crop that photo more and cut into it deeper, all bets are off, because you're going to see some star trails. They're still there, just at that frame, the full frame that you're shooting, you should be okay with this math. So just a couple examples of that. This was shot at Nautilus Dam back in September, I think. 10 millimeters. It's a crop camera, so it's really effectively 15. And this is kind of looking straight up overhead. 30-second exposure at ISO 2500. I had to do some cleanup in post. You'll wind up doing a lot of work in post with these kinds of shots. They're not easy to get to look right. This is the same place, looking out across the water. I'm not sure what that little village is across the water there, but you're looking over the lake, Nautilus Lake, and there's the Milky Way shooting up. This is Jupiter and Saturn here and here. And then this bridge, I painted with my little red light that I was telling you about. For that 30 seconds, I just did a quick red paint job on it to make the picture a little bit more interesting. Some other random ideas on slow shutter use. Abstracts, I kind of showed you one of those already that I did on a creek. Zooming in and out is kind of a fun trick. Some other subjects are fountains, trains and subways, people, amusement park rides. I have several of those actually, and I'll show you some examples. So this is just to get you thinking about what all could you do with a slow shutter. This was at Chattanooga, and I like the timing of this person walking right in between, or right in front of the central fountain here, and he's moving a little bit, so I've got some blur there with a 1/6 of a second shot. This shows you again 0.6 seconds. You know, doesn't sound real slow, but it's pretty slow when you have a train in the image. This is a 1/10 of a second shot of a ride at the North Georgia State Fair a couple years ago. And a more interesting shot of a ride there. And I had about 20. And again, these are the kinds of things you set up the tripod and shoot and shoot and shoot, because you don't know which ones you're going to like best until you see them. This one had a nice asymmetrical look to it, where some of the other ones just look like a swirling ball at the top. They're cool too, but this one was by far the most interesting of the group. 2.5 second shot. And this one looks almost like an abstract. I stood underneath the Ferris wheel to get this one. 4 second shot. And notice again, even though the aperture is pretty small on this one, so it's giving me some starbursts on these little green lights down here. Another shot from the fair here. I'm letting people blur. You've got a little bit of blur up here from this roller coaster going by, but I've got ghosts walking in front of me here. Another shot at Krog Street. We've got a little family with their dog and the baby coming toward me. That's 1/2 second. And you get a fair bit of movement in 1/2 second. Might have been better, even a little faster than that if I'd shot that at 1/4 second. This one with 1/30 of a second, you can see a good bit of blur going on pretty much everywhere, but you also have some, so you can see that the dad is smiling, mom is smiling as she's leaning in there, and they're trying to turn that thing around in the Nantahala. Kind of a fun speed, really tricky to do slow shutter panning with this kind of subject. And this is not a great shot, but it's about as good as I was able to get that day at that kind of a shutter speed. And then this one, I don't know why I like this one so much, but I really do. I wound up converting it to a monochrome and made it really grungy looking. The only thing that's in focus in this shot probably is this guy's right arm. Everything else is a little bit blurry, but I just kind of liked it because to me, it feels like it's conveying both the laid back attitude of the surfer, but at the same time, a little bit of drama with the splashing and the movement in the surfboard. We're back in Tennessee looking across the river. this boat's coming by. I've got a 2.5 second shutter speed, so he's not moving very fast. But it's kind of interesting. It just looks like a white arrow going across there. Here's an example of zooming. Handheld, I'm crouched down, trying to do a zoom while I'm clicking a 1/4 of a second shot and get a little bit of blur by twisting the zoom on the lens. You can do a lot of these and get them wrong because you're moving the camera while you're also spinning the zoom. But if you do enough of them, you'll probably get one that works. And some of them can be kind of cool. This one was done at the Atlanta Botanical Gardens, another 2.5 second zoom on the lower right. And the upper left is showing you what that subject actually was that I did the zoom on. There's a lot of cool things. If you go to the Botanical Gardens at Christmas time, there's a lot of cool subjects you can try that trick with. So basic prep for a slow shutter shoot, consider shooting in RAW for flexibility in post. I'm going to say that should just be your life. You should always shoot in RAW, in my opinion. You've got much more flexibility in post-processing. It takes more work, it takes more time, but if you're not shooting, sports photos for a living or something, or weddings, why not do it the best way you can if you're shooting art photography? Bring a sturdy tripod and a remote shutter button. Remember, when you're using your tripod, your image stabilization needs to be off. When your camera's on the tripod, your image stabilization needs to be turned off. I know that on Canons and I think Nikon also, IS is located in the lens. So you've got to think about that as a separate setting to turn that off when you're on the tripod. If you don't, what happens is the firmware that's trying to stabilize the image goes ahead and does that, even though the camera's already stable. So the result is it can actually make it sloppy looking or make it look a little bit blurred. Then don't forget to turn it back on again later. Bring ND filters to reduce exposure as needed, particularly for your tripod shots. Suggest the square system. It's a little pricey, but it's really the easiest way to go. Very flexible and pretty easy to get the stuff on and off your camera. And I would really consider bringing a polarizer too. In fact, anytime I'm doing natural stuff, I really want the polarizer.
We lost your sound, Rick.
I did? Can you hear me now?
No, not yet.
Just faintly.
Let me try plugging back in again.
That
That's-
worked.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. It still showed me being connected, so it must be something with the software here. Anyway, I'm saying bring a polarizer whenever you're shooting nature. Polarizers are very handy. You'll be stunned at the difference, especially if you have any sunlight out there. Plant life is much more reflective than you realize until you shoot with a polarizer and take that reflectivity out, and then the color shows up so much better. Bring that electrical tape for your viewfinder if you're an old schooler like us, DSLR shooters, and take many, many, many shots, especially when you're doing panning. You just don't know how many keepers you're going to have until you get them on the computer screen, especially with slow shutter panning of moving objects. I've got a few links here, which obviously you can't click on from your screen, but I'll share this presentation with Hylos and he can share it with the group later. These links are to websites that have much better work than what you just saw, showing you examples of slow shutter photography. And these three in particular give you a really broad sampling of different ideas for slow shutter stuff. And with that, I will say, are there any questions?
Hey, Rick, I noticed on your shots, well over half of them are kind of at fall time. What are your favorite seasons for shooting waterfalls?
I'll tell you, I have this crazy idea that one of these days I'm going to take all my gear when I know it's going to snow in the mountains, and I'm going to drive up to the mountains and test the all-wheel drive on my car, because I want to hike back to Panther Falls in particular and shoot that waterfall with snow around it and some ice on it. and I'll probably follow my keister and get hurt. But I'll let you know when I go up there. If you don't hear from me in 3 days, send the cops looking for me or something.
Well, I'm just glad that we got this presentation in before you went up and did that.
Put your video back on, Rick. Can't see you.
Really? Again?
Yeah, and we miss all the, never mind.
Hey, Rick, and I've got one more question for you. On the waterfalls, are all the ones you showed at Fort Mountain and, I wrote them down somewhere, Cloudland and all those, are they pretty much flowing all year long, or do you have to kind of wait until after some heavy rains?
Hang on just a second here. I'm sorry. Find out why this thing's not. Huh. I think my camera just crapped out. Can you hear me okay, though?
Yeah, it's good.
Can hear
Okay,
you
so-
fine.
Sorry, Patrick. Would you repeat the question?
Sure. All the waterfalls you shot, I noticed that they had great flow. Do you have to be sensitive to the seasonal dry spells, or do they
Okay.
flow all year long?
I think that's a great point. And actually, a couple of them were pretty low flow. Some of the ones that I think if you wanted to try to time flow, I mean, the best thing I could tell you is, watch the weather. If it rained yesterday, today's probably a good day to go see, But I've had mixed results with flow. I got some nice shots from Angel Falls in that area this past fall, but I got there about a week after the last rainfall, so the flow was very, very low. Pretty area still, but I'd like to have more water moving. So that's a good question. I think you just have to try to time to what the weather conditions were in the area that you're going to go, and maybe try to get there right after some rain.
Thanks.
Anything else?
Anything else? Anybody got any questions? I know Rick's got the answers.
Rick can't even figure out how to make his damn camera work. Oh well.
Well, you got your screen working, so we could see what you were doing.
Yeah.
So Rick,
One thing I'd like to make the comment to the group while Rick's fooling with that. We've gotten some feedback that you guys would like to change the time from 6:30 to 7. There is no time that we're going to be doing the change, but just stay tuned and we'll let you know. So had a lot of good feedback that 7 would work out good. And Diane, anytime I can get you putting the food on the table and not rushing is a good time.
I suspect the 6:30 start time went back to the library hours.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah. Oh, hey, Taylor.
And hopefully we'll have to go back to the library shortly,
That would be nice if we could do that.
but I don't think so.
No, probably not too soon.
For a while.
well, the one we were at was remodeling too.
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering with snowfall, do you think it would be possible to catch falling snowflakes and keep them sharp?
Yeah, probably
Would it
the best way to do that's going to be with a flash. You can freeze them in time by using a flash. Then the shutter speed doesn't matter so much, but yeah, because I only know that because I've done it, probably by accident.
Yeah, I've done that too. And yeah, flash is really helpful. It can be done, but it's not easy. I really appreciate what you brought here, Rick. This last fall, I went up in North Georgia and just spent a day shooting and had a ball doing this. It really takes it's some experiment, but you're right. A lot of patience about trying a lot of different exposures and playing with just all the variables, and really come out with some very different shots.
Yeah, thanks. I think what I found was, and I went up a number of times this fall. We were talking earlier about retirement, And Pat's been lazy for 4 years already, but I've only been lazy for 1 year. But you know, especially in the COVID environment, how much can you really do? It's boring. So I'd hop in the car and, you know, challenge my low sports car to get through freaking dirt roads for 5 miles to get to a hike for 2 more miles so I could photograph a waterfall. And I think my logic was, if I've got to go through all of that to get back there, I'm going to shoot this thing a million ways from Sunday, and hopefully I like one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we got digital cameras now. People shouldn't be afraid. They ought to just go out there and wear that thing out. Fill up
Yep.
that 16 gigabyte and come home and throw 99% of them away, and you'll find 2 good ones.
Yep.
Yep, you just have to steel yourself with a cup of coffee or a drink or whatever it takes to work through all that stuff in Lightroom, right?
Well, guys, one thing in passing as we're closing out, I'd like to just extend a shout out to Sue and Shiva and Lucy and Mary Ann, the other folks who were our guests this evening. I shot you a quick little chat letting you know about folks to reach out to us if you're interested in joining our club. So we would love to have you. Competition is a good thing, and it's friendly, and then we got a little bit of an edge to it with Mark Buckert's, to where we actually rank it. But I think you've seen from the Facebook that Mark posted, we've got a great Facebook page that group. You just go out. Mark kicks out a new theme almost every week, and this week it's close-ups and macros, and a lot of fun. So to our visitors, thank you for coming this evening. And of course, to our regulars and everyone else, thank you as well.
And the next competition is nostalgia,
Nostalgia. That's right.
and pictures are due to be emailed by Monday. What? Monday the
Look. Make sure we're right here.
Yes, next Monday, right?
It is next Monday.
I just didn't know what the number was, the
Yeah.
date.
25.
25.
Okay. 3 p.m. on Monday, the 25th.
Yep.
That's 7 days after the 18th.
Usually.
Tonight. Yeah.
And if somebody can give me a good definition of nostalgia in photographs, it's going to be interesting
Good
too.
luck with that. I did go looking for that too, and spent and it's there's a lot of possibilities with nostalgia.
If you go on Google and put nostalgia and photographs on there, I was amazed at the pages that are there.
Yeah, that's right. And how it's interpreted.
Right.
Yeah.
If you look for what are different types of nostalgia, there's close to a dozen different definitions of nostalgia to begin with. So take that into account too.
Photos of some of our members are nostalgic in themselves.
Careful now, careful.
Hey, Rick, do you miss Chandler's humor?
I do. And you know, Ralph's snarkiness, and yeah. You guys all look good though. We're still on the right side of the dirt.
Exactly.
That's right.
Well, Hylos, I think you did a great job in inviting Rick to be our speaker this evening. Rick, very nice job.
It was good. It was good.
Good job, Rick. Very good job.
Thank you so much.
Great job. Great job.
So everybody
Thank you,
going away
guys.
now?
Thank you very much.
I think so.
All righty.
Oh, we had 30 people on here tonight.
Okay.
Good deal.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
31.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
You
Night
don't
all.
count.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Hylos, don't hang up yet.
Oh, okay.
I just want to ask you, so is our login going to be the same one each?
Exactly the same one every time.
Okay.
You didn't get an email?
I can't find it because did Chandler send it? Did Pat send it? Did Hylos
sent it.
send I did. I just couldn't find it. I was pulling through everything and couldn't find it.
Okay, well, anyway, the one you got tonight works next time.
Okay. And every time.
And every time that, yeah,
Perfect.
as long as I'm on
Okay.
the right side of the dirt.
Okay.
See y'all next time.
See ya.